Eva Davis, and I am privileged to teach Russian at this institution for over 30 years. I am happy to see you here, new faces, old faces, all faces. Thank you for taking time from your evening and spending it, at least part of it, with us. You will not regret. Before I allow my Russian club officer to continue, I would like to take a moment and extend a sincere thank you to my colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Molch, whose very idea led us to our wonderful speaker for tonight. So thank you very much. And now Katya, Russian club officer. Oh, please, do not fail me and make a trip to the food. Make sure that's just a Slavic tradition. I mean, if there's any food left, yeah, I'll be in trouble.
That means we don't like you.
Yeah. Right? Well, especially if you say that.
So that's what I did. Good evening and welcome to our Russian Enrichment program. My name is Viana Azuna and I'm an officer of the Russian Club here at Angela State. Tonight's presentation has been organized by our Russian Club and with support of the English and Modern Language Department. Tonight we are very grateful to have Dr. Denise Youngblood as our guest speaker. Her presentation is titled Americanitis, American Influence in the Soviet Cinema from the Revolution to the Death of Stalin. Dr. Elizabeth Molch will make our official introduction of our speaker. Dr. Molch is a professor of French and Film Studies Committee Chair at our university. She teaches French and German language, literature, and our culture classes. For 10 years, and together with Ms. Davis, she has been teaching a course on French, German, and Soviet film in the 1920s. Following the presentation, we will have a short question and answer session. Thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy the evening. Let us all welcome Dr. Molch and Dr.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, and now I have the privilege of introducing to you Dr. Denise Youngblood. I'm delighted that she was able to come here. Dr. Denise Youngblood is Professor of History Emerita of the University of Vermont, where she taught for close to 30 years, and she served as the chair of the history department and also as the vice provost for faculty and academic affairs. Today, Dr. Youngblood is one of the foremost specialists on Russian and Soviet cinema. Her research is spanning the years 1908 till 1992, Soviet cultural politics, film and history, World War II and Cold War films, and comparative Soviet-American cinematic relations. Already as a graduate student at Stanford University, she was able to spend a year at the All-Union State Institute of Cinematography in Moscow. That's really, really a privilege. And she gained access through this elite institution for Soviet film directors, editors, and cinematographers. Since receiving her PhD from Stanford University with a dissertation on Soviet cinema of the silent era, 1918 till 1935, Dr. Youngblood has published 7 books and truly an impressive number of articles. How did you do that exactly? I don't know.
I didn't have a life.
Okay. Her book, Movies for the Masses, Popular Cinema and Soviet Society in the 1920s, published by Cambridge University Press and honored with the Health Prize for Best Book by a Woman in Slavic Studies, has become mandatory reading for many film and history classes. Her book, Russian War Films on the Cinema Front, 1914 till 2005, published in 2007, received the Choice Outstanding Academic Title 2007. Her most recent article, Russians at the Gates, Spies, Saboteurs, and Provocateurs in Jack Ryan 3 and Treason, is forthcoming in a special issue of Historical Reflections that focuses on Russians in TV, or on TV, right.
Maybe they're even in our TV.
Yeah, no. So, but tonight, however, we will not look at Russians on American TV, but instead look at the influences American film had on Soviet film. Tonight, Professor Youngblood will present to you Americanitis, American Influences in Soviet Cinema from the Revolution to the Death of Stalin. Please welcome Professor Denise Youngblood. I'm so excited that she has agreed to come here and to speak to us, share her knowledge with our students and the community at large. So thank you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thanks to the Russian Club for co-sponsoring my lecture. Thanks to Dr. Davis for making all the arrangements. I'm really happy to be here to talk about something that I certainly love, and that is Russian film. I'm a Cold War kid, and my interest in Russia was an act of rebellion against my anti-communist father. He was very, very, very worried about my progress through life with this field. And when I told him very excitedly that I decided I would write my doctoral dissertation on Soviet movies, he said, "Did they even make any?" So I know that most people don't think too much about Russian and Soviet film, but they were very, very important. And so I'd like to go at this from a somewhat different angle, not from the famous art films that won prizes at festivals, but to look at what Russian and Soviet people actually wanted to see. Now, a century ago, after the Bolshevik Revolution established the world's first communist state, Soviet citizens were fascinated by American capitalist culture, especially its wealth, luxurious consumer goods, and lively entertainments. Most noteworthy was their love of American movies. And in the 1920s, they dominated Soviet screens. That's what most people were watching in the first decade of Soviet power. And they continued to influence Soviet directors even after most American films were banned in the 1930s. So what I'd like to talk to you about is to show you how early Soviet directors adapted Hollywood style to communist themes, and how Americans were depicted as characters in these movies. And these might be a little bit different from what you might imagine. Starting with a zany satire from 1924, The Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks. Okay, poster from that. And then moving on to an over-the-top musical called The Circus, 1936, and ending with a World War II spy thriller, Meeting on the Elba, from 1949. I'll also discuss Stalin's passion for American movies, especially westerns and musicals, and the importance of American films captured during World War II, which led to the explosive post-war cult of Johnny Weissmuller as Tarzan. In 1951, the year before Stalin's, 2 years before Stalin's death, excuse me, Weissmuller's films were first, second, and third at the Soviet box office when the Cold War is really getting cold. So this is quite a paradox. And my point is, we have this love-hate relationship with Russia. We're at a low point right now. And they have this love-hate relationship with us. Now, let's talk about, just briefly, about the political and economic background to this. After the revolution of 1917, there was a protracted civil war in Russia that ended in 1921. There were 8 to 10 million people killed in this conflict. It's huge. It's not very well known. It's huge. And there was widespread devastation, as you can imagine. There was a major famine. The Bolsheviks were busy issuing decrees that they couldn't necessarily enforce. And we forget that. Oh, they abolished private property. Well, who said that they could enforce that, And one of the things they did in 1919 was they nationalized the film industry, but there wasn't any film industry left. And so they met because the directors in the pre-revolutionary period had fled. They'd gone to Europe, and they took their films and their equipment with them. So there wasn't much left. And so during the Russian Civil War, there were a few very crude, short propaganda films made. Very, very crude. Now, when the Civil War was over, in 1921, Lenin decided on a strategic retreat that was called the New Economic Policy. And that was to relax, to allow the economy to diversify, but he still kept the film industry nationalized because, as he said in 1918, film is for us the most important of all arts. Now, I've never found a single film that Lenin actually saw, but what he was fascinated by was the promise of mechanically reproduced images to educate and influence the Soviet population. The state, however, had little money to give to productions. So the State Film Trust, which managed the industry, was given leeway to figure out how to make money. And they had a great idea. Well, let's import a lot of foreign films, especially American films. Everybody loves them. And this then will draw Soviet citizens to the movie theaters, pay their good money for tickets, and we will be able to use the profits to fund more political films. Okay. Now, in 1922, the director that we're going to be talking about first, Lev Kuleshov, wrote this. And by the way, he was only 23 years old, very young, but he was authoritative. He wrote this: anyone who has noticed which films cause the audience to react will conclude the following. Foreign films appeal more than Russian ones. And two of the foreign films, all of the American ones and detective ones, appeal most. Both superficial people and deep-thinking officials are equally frightened by Americanitis. This is the term that he coined, Americanitis in Russian, for those of you who know Russian. And detectivitis, meaning a love of detective films, detektivshina, in the cinema, and explain the success of particular films by the extraordinary decadence and poor taste of youth. I'm sure you young people here will appreciate that. Always blame it on the young people. Okay. Now, this domination of foreign films, especially American, was pronounced. In the decade from 1921 to 1928, there were 1,700 American films shown in Soviet Russia. There were 500 Soviet films made. But the numbers don't really tell the whole story, because we have to know, where were the films screened? Who watched them? Audiences just did not want to watch these Soviet films. They just didn't. And for example, The Thief of Baghdad, starring Douglas Fairbanks, who was a matinee idol all over the world at that time, 1924, ran for over a year in Moscow's largest cinema palace that seated 1,000 people, selling out virtually every show. Fairbanks and his wife, Mary Pickford, you might have heard from her, were so enchanted by their Russian fans that they actually made a visit to Moscow in 1926 and drew hysterical crowds of cheering fans. This was recorded on newsreels. There were fan magazines. There were biographies written about them. It's not quite the picture that you might have had of the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Okay, now, certain directors, like Kuleshov and others, answered this call for money-making popular entertainment by turning out comedies, melodramas, and adventures that were fast-paced and fun, and only superficially Soviet. So, Mr. West was one of the most popular films of the 1920s. The story is that the president of the YMCA, this fellow, Mr. West, with his flag, and note the number of stars is completely wrong. He decides to go to the Soviet Union to check out what he's been reading about those Bolsheviks, whether they really have sabers in their mouths. He's looking at some leafing through some magazines at the beginning. And he has a bodyguard with him. And of course that bodyguard is a cowboy. Cowboy Jetty, wearing a 10-gallon hat and waving a 6-shooter around. And Mr. West is kidnapped by some gangsters called the Count and the Countess. And then at the very end of the film, it's just hilarious. At the very end of the film, okay, I've got to get this to play. At the very end of the film, everybody's rescued by a member of the Cheka, which is the Soviet secret police. Okay, let's take a, this is the first chase scene in Soviet cinema. And this is filmed on the streets of Moscow, you know, on location. This is 1924, 100 years ago. Cowboy Jetty, you'll get a better look at him soon. The streets of Moscow probably were this empty because nobody had cars. There he is. Technically, this is a pretty amazing film. And Kuleshov was only 25 at this point. Got the wrong car, misread the license plate. Mr. West came with a lot of suitcases, let's put it that way, because that's the way Americans are. Then this scene is to be very famous, and I will explain why when we get more into it. Getty, and that's the actor, not a stuntman. He later became a famous director. This was the last film he acted in. That is the Church of Christ the Savior, the real one that was blown up in the 1930s at Stalin's orders. Yep, for the swimming pool, you know it. It's been rebuilt. This was really dangerous, and Barnett felt that the director put his life in danger for no good reason.
Do they not look like a pattern?
Yeah. You know, today we can do it by CGI, but they couldn't do it that way then.
And you have to trust the civil wires.
He got hurt. Uh-oh.
Just go there. Yeah, it's okay.
No, it's not okay. How do I get back?
No brainer. That's not how Queen died. And the Magnificent Seven died.
Oh, yes, thank you, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm a techno-klutz. Okay, so, great film, funny film, very popular. Yes, sir.
Well, you want questions during, or?
I would rather not, if you think you can save them, but
Okay.
you've started, so.
Well, usually the money is an interesting part. The American films, were they dubbed in Russian?
Yeah, this is the silent era, okay, so they have the Russian language subtitles.
So they have the,
Yeah, they did. Probably, let's save questions for later. Okay. Yeah, I think that will probably be better, but that's a very important question. Silent films were easier because it was cheap, you know, to add the subtitles. Okay, now, in 1928, a phenomenon known as the Cultural Revolution began in the Soviet Union. That lasted until 1932. It had many manifestations of persecution against artists, including popular artists like Kuleshov and others. There was a backlash against these foreign and bourgeois films led by stridently communist directors and also well-known avant-garde filmmakers. Because this is what they said: how can our boring films possibly, I'm adding that bit about the boring films, how can our films possibly compete with this kind of trashy entertainment? There's only one thing to do: get them off the screens, ban them altogether. And that is what happened. And so by 1932, there was a virtual end of importation of foreign films, except to one individual. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And a turn to what was known as socialist realism, which meant very simple, straightforward plots, positive heroes, recognizable villains, very strictly communist in their orientation. People didn't like them, I guarantee you. Now, who got to still watch American films, you might wonder? Stalin. He imported, or ordered the importation, I guess he was too busy to import them himself. He imported films for his own viewing in his Kremlin screening room. He was an insomniac, and he watched movies for 4 hours a night through most of the 1930s. And I've seen, you know, the viewing diaries that are related to this. He loved American movies, westerns and musicals, and he would send over, when he liked a film, he'd send over his favorite films to his favorite Soviet directors, like Grigory Alexandrov. Alexandrov had traveled in Europe and also to Hollywood. And Alexandrov actually liked Americans pretty well. So it's interesting to see what he does with his work. Now the Circus, 1936, has all the elements: drama, music, a visual extravaganza, people getting shot out of cannons. I'll show you that in a moment. The premise is that an American circus star named Marion Dixon escapes an American lynch mob with her black baby. She falls into the clutches of a Nazi. Got to get the Germans in, because remember, this is 1936. But she finds love and freedom in the USSR and total racial tolerance for her son. Now here's a picture of a real American, Jimmy Patterson. Now what you might not know is that a fair number of African American socialists and communists emigrated to the Soviet Union in the 1930s to escape racial prejudice in this country and hoping to find tolerance and freedom in the Soviet Union. Didn't quite work out that way. Jimmy Patterson, though, did grow up in the Soviet Union. Now let's take a look at this one. This clip. The music was by Shostakovich, by the way. This is a real prestige production. All right, now, Eva, how do I get out of this again? I'm so sorry.
Just go back here. Oh, it's down there, that little thing. Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, now that was along with a film called Chicago, one of the biggest box office hits of the 1930s. It played over and over and over again. All right, so what comes up next? Well, we're headed into war. And naturally, during the Great Patriotic War, as World War II was known in the Soviet Union, film production plummeted. There were a few full-length wartime dramas that focused on women in occupied lands. There were some newsreels made, some filmed operas, but they had more important things on their mind, like saving their country. The post-war devastation was a calamity like none other. At least 27 million Soviet citizens lost their lives in that war. I mean, it's a catastrophe. That's nearly half the losses of the entire war on both fronts. Movies took a back seat because they had to rebuild. They had to rebuild everything. They had to rebuild the industry. They had to rebuild schools. They had to rebuild everything. And so production was at a low point. In 1951, there were only 9 feature films made in the Soviet Union. In the US in 1951, there were 400, giving you, the contrast there. Every Soviet feature film made during this period, it was called the film famine, had to score big propaganda points. And with the rise of the Cold War and tensions with the US, this is kind of hard to explain to Soviet citizens. Weren't the Americans our friends? Weren't they our allies? And now they're our enemies? The same thing was going on in this country too. So there were 8 big budget Cold War films made over 7 years in the post-war period before Stalin's death. But the biggest Soviet hit of the decade, Soviet-made hit of the decade, was this one, Meeting on the Elba, 1945. Again by Grigory Alexandrov, who directed The Circus. Now the emphasis in this film is on 2 Americans. And Alexandrov was very clear that he did not hate Americans. He felt that the American people were very good people, but they had been deceived by the capitalists. They had been deceived by the militarists. And they had been deceived by their government. But at heart, they were good people. And so it was important for him to have a good American in this film, along with the evil ones. But naturally, the evil ones are so much more interesting, the evil Americans. Lots of evil Americans in this film. But the interesting twist is that the chief villains are women. Mrs. McDermott, the wife of the American commandant, runs the black market in this German town divided by the Elbe River. It's a fictitious town called Altenstadt. She runs the black market in Lucky Strike cigarettes. The Lucky Strike cigarette trucks are careening around the town, hitting people, endangering them. She pillages Germans of their cultural heritage. She even orders that an old growth forest be clear-cut for some bizarre reason to send the wood to Germany. She presides over a deranged court of drunkards, including her husband, General McDermott. But he doesn't have any power at all. But even more powerful than Mrs. McDermott is Janet Sherwood. Whoops. Right there in the middle, that's Janet Sherwood. She's the same actress who played Marion Dixon in The Circus. Now she is, swathed in furs, and she's trying to seduce the German commandant, Major Kuzmin, on the other side of the river. And there's the good American, Major Hill, looking askance at her. She says she's looking for her father. She claims to have been German-born, and she's looking for her father. They never explain why her name is Janet Sherwood, if she was born in Germany. But in reality, she is seeking out to smuggle out a Nazi war criminal. And she's going to do this by seducing the upright commandant, Major Kuzmin. She doesn't succeed in doing that. It kind of gets a little bit close. And then in the end of the film, she takes off her furs, and underneath the furs, we see she's in a uniform. And she's announced to be Miss Collins of the Federal Intelligence Bureau. And she arrests the good American, this guy, Major Hill, and he's as a traitor, because he's gotten too friendly with his Soviet counterpart. Let's see. I put space. No. Oh no. Okay, let me try this. I'm sorry, folks. Nothing is happening here. help someone? I'm sorry. Thank you.
Oh.
I'm trying to get to that input at the end. Yeah. Okay, let's see if it, okay, now the red arrow should come up.
An interesting picture. Hit the icon at the bottom right. Does it start?
That one?
No, the one to the left of that. Right there. And have it, there it is.
Thank you. All right, now we're contrasting peaceful Soviet-occupied Altenstadt with what's happening on the other side of the river, controlled by Americans. That is a German scientist, Professor Dietrich, who is being seduced by the Americans to come over to the American side. This is an officers' club, and those instructions say that enlisted men are not allowed. And in a classless society like the Soviet Union, of course, nothing like that would ever happen. Ha ha. That girl has been taken away to be raped. But you see that the professor, the German professor, is disgusted. And so he goes back to the Soviet side and decides to keep his secrets, sell his secrets to the Soviet Union. Okay. Now, this film was the most popular film of 1949. Now, how do we understand this? Does this mean that Soviet citizens actually bought this? What did they really like about this film? Well, it's really fast-paced, and there are a lot of really interesting villains in it. And we know, we like to watch villains. They're much more interesting than heroes are. It was also an opportunity to see glamour throughout the course of this film, and the food, and the expensive liquor, and the music, and the revelry at the officers' club. For the first time in 20 years, Soviet audiences heard jazz. It had been banned. So they loved it. There's an interesting book about that called Red and Hot, about Soviet jazz and the influence of American music in the Soviet Union. So they loved this. They got a little snatch of what it was like. You know, the wild revelry. It didn't look disgusting to them. The dancing, very, very, very interesting. Okay, let's end with Tarzan here. 1951, as I said, it was first, second, and third at the box office. It sparked a Soviet youth craze. This was the beginning of the youth movement in the Soviet Union, the post-war youth movement. They called themselves Tarzantsy. So Tarzan, with this Russian suffix, Tarzantsy. They imitated his slick-back hairstyle, and they yodeled that famous jungle yell. And this was incredibly disruptive to strict, gray, hungry Soviet post-war society. Now, Stalin died in 1953, 2 years later. What would have happened if he hadn't died then? I don't know if he would have pulled the Tarzan films. Probably he would have. But there are many important Soviet intellectuals talk in their memoirs, like Joseph Brodsky, a famous poet, talks about how much he loved those Tarzan films and how the freedom of Tarzan swinging through the jungle gave him the idea that freedom was possible. Now, he didn't ever swing through the jungle. He wrote great poetry. So what's the story here? Well, the story here is that things are not always what they seem. It's my very strong belief that regardless of the tensions at any given moment between Russia, the Soviet Union, and the US, we need to keep talking. We need to keep learning about each other. We need to keep paying attention. Because one of my fields is Soviet-American cinematic relations. And I've written a book on the subject of the Cold War with a colleague of mine, Tony Shaw, who is a specialist in American Cold War films. I have many many Russian friends who built their scholarly careers on studying the US. And are they ever stuck right now? I let them communicate with me. You know, it's very brief, very coded. But there are good people there. There are good people there. And so I don't want to proselytize. We've been talking about fun here. But it's what is called serious fun, I think. You can learn an awful lot about a society by taking a look at its popular culture. Now, I haven't said anything about how I know the things that I claim to know. I'm happy to answer questions about my research, how this was done. Any other questions, like the subtitling or dubbing question? They didn't dub, by the way. Even in the sound era, they didn't dub. They had voiceover narration called a dictator, and one, usually male, pompous voice, read all the dialogue. And that was intended to make imported movies unattractive. Didn't work. Didn't work. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
So when they were importing American movies, were the movie producers getting paid?
Yes. They did it legally. Yes, they paid. They bought them. Yeah.
So we ended up making money
Yes.
on
Yeah.
their stuff.
Yeah.
You mentioned spy movies. Was like things like James Bond, massive in Russia.
Oh gosh, no. They made their own spy movies. And that kind of movie, we're moving ahead now into the 60s and 70s. Those kinds of movies, American films were shown again, and they were shown through exchanges, cultural exchanges. But, well, James Bond's British, of course, but no James Bond. No. But they tried to make James Bond like Soviet films. They knew these movies. They just weren't shown publicly in theaters. Yes?
What's the contribution of Sergei Einstein?
The contribution of Sergei Eisenstein is that he was a very famous art film director. He revolutionized the political film. His movies were all deeply unpopular to Soviet audiences. I've read archival accounts of, they used to send listeners to the movie theaters to get the reactions, and people would jeer and cough in Eisenstein's famous movies like Battleship Potemkin and say, when is this going to be over? Do we have to watch this? And people were forced to watch it. They would take workers in their mandatory worker club meetings and force them to watch Eisenstein. Now, I'm not saying he's not a great film artist. He is an enduring film artist. But in terms of a contribution to the history of Soviet cinema, it's quite marginal. World cinema, a different story.
I just have a comment. I was really impressed with the very first one, the cinematography, and how sharp it was, as far as you could recognize their face. It just,
That was just it. That's just a matter of a better copy being made. I'm
Okay.
sorry that some of these copies were.
well,
Yeah.
you know, if that means their archives are taken to themselves.
Well, I think that these were probably illegally copied. done. Not that first one. No, you're right. You're absolutely right about Mr. West. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
So just want to reference for the first one with Mr. West.
Yeah.
It's interesting, like the cowboy, he's getting chased by the Soviet secret police, right?
But just by the police, because he's racing through the streets of Moscow waving his gun around.
Oh, okay, because I was like, I wasn't sure how his name was kidnapped in the Bolsheviks, so I'm like,
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
His boss, Mr. West, that's
Okay.
who he's looking for.
Mhm.
But, you know, I mean, you can't run through the streets waving your gun, or well, we can, I guess, we do it all the time. But, yeah, ouch, sorry, I shouldn't say that. But you see, I mean, that's why they're chasing him.
Okay.
They just want to stop him.
Yeah.
They don't want to stop him from finding his boss, and eventually when Mr. West is found, totally unharmed, he's found by the Chekov, which was the first incarnation of the KGB. Yeah, totally phony. And actually Kuleshov was forced to tack that on. It's so unlike the rest of the movie. It's so unlike it. Yeah. Yes.
Well, they seem to get the art of the car chase real early,
Yes.
but was the technical standard at that time compatible with the U.S., or did they have their own to make things incompatible like they did with television?
Yeah, that's a great question, and like they did with railroads.
Yeah.
No, they were compatible, and in fact, I'll tell you why. Because they were buying most of this equipment from Germany. And then in the best equipment, of course, was not made in the U.S. at that time. Film-making equipment was made in Germany. And when sound came to the Soviet Union, it was a nightmare, because Stalin had decided that they couldn't afford to send the Germans money anymore, for obvious reasons, political reasons as well. And their sound equipment, recording equipment, was just terrible. Just terrible. No other countries were interested in showing this film. Yes.
So it's interesting, you said that Stalin had a video diary, like what did he watched a lot of like foreign films, what did he like, and how did we know like we have that video diary? Was he just like, he wrote it all down?
Okay, no, he had one of his flunkies write it all down. His secretary wrote it all down, and it's very interesting, at the end of every film, there would be a silence. And Stalin he was there with other members of the Politburo. So high-ranking Soviet officials are spending the wee hours of the morning, 5 nights a week, watching American movies. They sit there silently until Stalin speaks, and then everybody chimes in. So he likes the action. He likes the music. He likes the positive portrayals. That's what he likes.
Do you have like a particular favorite one?
Well, he liked Busby Berkeley musicals, which you probably have never heard of, and that's okay. He was very fond of John Ford westerns. So he liked westerns, and he liked musicals. He liked fun. He liked fast-paced action. He liked good guys winning. Yeah. Except the Soviet directors then remade these films, not with Americans as the good guys, but with, their folks as the good guys. So they were able to make some fun movies. Yeah.
So, I mean, I know like in this period, the Soviet art films were influencing the American filmmakers, but did they have any kind of awareness of the Soviet pop culture? Like these,
No.
like totally off? Okay.
None. And when I started my research, I was told there weren't any. And I was even told by my Soviet advisor, who knew quite a bit better than that there weren't any. This was nonsense, what I was trying to do. And then eventually, he was so angry with me that this was in 1978, 1979. And the US and the USSR had just signed the Helsinki Accords. And the flow of materials that I was entitled to get under the Helsinki Accords just stopped. And so the American Embassy filed a complaint, an official complaint on my behalf to the Soviet Ministry of Higher Education. And then the next thing I knew, I was called in on the carpet by the Dean of Foreign Students, who was a KGB colonel. And my advisor was standing there with him, screaming at me, "You are the laziest, stupidest person I have ever met." And then he said, "I am not going to be your advisor anymore." And then he started screeching, "I denounce you, I denounce you, I denounce you," and stormed out of the office, slamming the door shut. And the Dean of Foreign Students was someone that I had prepped to be my friend, because I would buy cartons of Lucky Strikes and Camels. And Marlboros. Oh, he loved Marlboros. I'm sorry, I remember now. He loved Marlboro cigarettes with the flip top cartons, and he would expertly tip a cigarette into his mouth. So he was my friend by this point. And he said, he says, "Okay." He says, "Let's sit down." He said, "Here's your list. Let's figure out what we're going to let you see." And it was smooth sailing from there. But it was those cigarettes. It was those cigarettes.
How did you get the information about what kind of cigarettes you favored?
Oh, anything American is going to be favored. And so I had access, because I was traveling. I wasn't on a diplomatic passport, but I had diplomatic privileges. I could go to the diplomat store, and where you could buy Marlboros.
So the Berioska store?
No, this was different. No, this was the diplomatic gastronome. And you had to be on my exchange program or have a diplomatic passport to get in that store. And I just knew, I observed that he was a heavy smoker. Aha! I know what he'll like. And he did. I guessed right.
Did they ever import any like U.S. animated films? Like, were they watching Disney still?
Yes, they were actually. Thank you for bringing that up. Disney was very good. The Disney cartoons were very important in as a teaching tool for Soviet animation. They liked those stories quite a lot. I'm glad you raised that.
Oh, I asked earlier, what's my question? What would be the Russian, like during that era of the spy film, what was their favorite type of, if they had their favorite movie?
A spy type film. Well, there was this was a made-for-television movie series called 17 Moments of Spring, and it was about a Soviet agent embedded in Germany during World War II. Fabulous, fabulous. A cult film. People still watch it and still talk about it. But the production values were really good. The excitement factor was high. It's a great, great series. And it was directed by a woman, which is somewhat unusual. See, I think, yeah.
I was just curious about, so in the late 70s and early 80s, I guess, did they watch Ronald Reagan movies?
No.
I was just curious,
No,
like.
that's a good question.
That's
a good question, but no.
Okay.
No, because even then, he was a bit of a wild card in terms of politics.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't know if they.
No, they just,
some
no,
of his were
no,
when
that
he
was
was young
just,
and before he was.
yeah, no. But that's a good question. It's a reasonable question. They didn't, by that point after the war, they didn't have a lot of money to spend. So the films that I was talking about, those Tarzan movies, they didn't pay for those Tarzan movies. They captured them from the Germans, who apparently were watching Tarzan movies. They also captured a lot of Hungarian films that were very popular with Soviet audiences. Yeah.
Do you have like any pictures of like what like the youths who sort of had this Tarzan looked? I guess very 60s, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, except it was earlier.
Yeah.
No, I actually have not seen pictures of it because that would have been rather dangerous.
Yeah.
For these young people to have their pictures taken. But then there was another kind of crazy youth movement called the Stilyagi movement, where people just dressed in, young people dressed in wild colors, usually young men, in very wild colors, and very upsetting to their Soviet elders. It was great. It was great. There was even a movie made about it to try to point out how foolish this was, but they didn't buy it.
Well, at that time, our propaganda machine, I mean, Hollywood is in full gear, Disney was in full gear.
Yeah.
The Germans were making a lot of propaganda movies. Was there anything, I mean, they were hurting, but were they making propaganda films for their public?
Well, sure. And I should have, you know, all these films that I'm showing you, those are propaganda films. But what they know how to do is the iron fist and the velvet glove. They're preaching Soviet values and showing who the Soviet Union's villains are, but in an entertaining format. There were some that were quite crude. There were some, you know, hunting for the internal enemy films from the 1930s that are really pretty terrible. But again, audiences didn't like to see those films. So there is audience, films can be made, but people have to go see them. And there are so many cases in the Soviet Union of people being commandeered, like right off the factory floor, to go sit and watch this movie. They didn't like it. They didn't like it. And when it came to spending their hard-earned rubles, they didn't want to spend it on that kind of thing. They wanted something that was fun. But every movie had a message. All the movies that I've shown you have a message.
But it wasn't as, I mean, if you look at the cartoons, they were so overtly, you know, trying to stay at the message. Evidently, they didn't do that type of thing.
They didn't. Now, again, they didn't in the films that people actually watch. You see, you have two sets of films in the Soviet Union. The ones that people were supposed to like but didn't, and refused to sit down and watch. Refused to buy a ticket. Had to be forced to watch them. They didn't want that stuff. But yeah, Soviet propaganda is not anywhere near as crude as you might have been led to believe that it was. All these films were propaganda films. Other questions? I know we're getting to the end of our time.
When the last one beating on the elbow,
Yeah.
it's sort of like, it's a film noir, right? It's
Yeah.
film noir with
Very much
femme
so.
fatale.
Yeah.
But it's also a little bit like The Third Man, right? Where
Yes.
Germany is divided,
Yes.
or in that case,
Yeah.
Vienna,
Yeah.
and they are going from one zone to the other one.
Yeah.
And so it's really elements of the Western world, also in the construction of the
Oh,
West.
absolutely, absolutely. You know, again, Soviet audiences couldn't see these films, but Soviet directors could see these Western films. So it's not as though they were making this all up on their own. They're very heavily influenced mainly by American directors, but also by European directors. Yeah. Yeah.
Were any of these films, not necessarily the ones you showed today, but were a lot of Soviet films produced for foreign audiences?
Oh, that's a whole other super interesting story. Oh, how they wanted their films to be loved by audiences outside. And in the mid-50s, as part of a thaw in relations between the US and the USSR, when Khrushchev was in power, there was a film exchange agreement that didn't last very long. The Americans, oh, they were smart. They sent things like Roman Holiday, starring Audrey Hepburn. Oh, Soviet audiences loved Audrey Hepburn. And what were American audiences getting in return? Really boring historical stuff that no American would ever want to see. And hey, no Soviet really wanted to see those either. And so that agreement just sort of faded. But that's a great question. Oh, they wanted it so badly. They wanted it so badly.
Wasn't the 50s or 60s when they started making, there's one that my friends in Moscow always watch on New Year's Day.
Yes, and you've just scared the name out of the name of that film out of me, and they still watch it.
It's what is looking for. Irony of fate.
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, The Irony of Fate, yes.
The Irony of Fate.
It is a cult film,
Yes.
it's so funny, it's very specifically Soviet though, very specifically Soviet.
Yeah.
There's a mix-up of, apartments, blocks in different cities look the same. And drunken revelry on New Year's Eve, these people end up in the wrong apartments in the wrong city. It's absolutely hilarious, but very Soviet.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You might enjoy watching that one. It's actually very funny. Even the key fits from this Moscow block and fits into this Leningrad apartment of when he ends up on a plane. I mean, it's just it's a very funny one. Yes.
Right. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Besides kind of like the propaganda message, was there anything that was like very unique to like a Russian sense of humor or a thing or kind of attraction that was not really present in like American films as we kind of understand it?
That's a really good question, because humor and comedy is really very socially and culturally specific. And things that Russians find absolutely hilarious, like I just really love Stalin jokes. But when I tried telling them, and these were Soviets would tell these Stalin jokes, quietly. and the Brezhnev jokes, those were great, the Brezhnev jokes. I would tell them to my, American family and friends. What? Why is that funny? So it just doesn't, humor tends not to transfer very well unless it's something really basic like slapstick.
Yeah.
Anything else? You have been a fabulous audience.
Is there currently a Russian film industry?
Oh yeah. And after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the nationalization of the film industry ended. And the 1990s were a terrible period for Russian filmmakers because you see they didn't know how, there were no producers. They didn't know how to get money for their films, for their projects. They figured it out, and there have been a lot of co-productions, a lot of French and German money went into the making of Russian films. See, now they're in a world of trouble. Nobody likes them anymore. And so the funds from France and Germany for most Russian movies have dried up. And they're making really ghastly, crude, patriotic films, horrid films, just absolutely horrible, trying to prove that their ownership over Ukraine, that kind of thing. Yeah. You've been a fabulous audience. I want to apologize for the technical glitches. I'm very, very sorry about that. But I really appreciated all of your comments, and thank you for inviting me to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Youngblood, for your informative presentation. A special thank you to Ms. Jeanette McWilliams, our volunteer supporter of Russian Enrichment Program. Dr. Mulch in the English and Modern Languages Department for helping us put together this event. The Russian Club cannot exist without your hard work and passion for education. Your students are incredibly grateful for your mentorship and support. Thank you once again for coming and supporting Dr. Youngblood and our Russian Club. I hope everyone enjoyed this presentation and will now leave knowing more about Russia and its unique history and culture. Dr.